conservative foreign policy scholar Max Boot tells us why he feels he doesn't belong anymore.
Donald Trump is making me feel like a foreigner for the first time in my life.
But first, here's my take. Watching the Republican tax plan race through Congress, one is reminded of a big apparent difference between Donald Trump's program and other populist movements in the Western world. In America, Trump is leading something that is best described as plutocratic populism, a mixture of traditional populist causes with extreme libertarian ones. Congress's own think tanks, the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office, calculate that in 10 years, people making between $50,000 and $75,000 a year, around the median income in America, would effectively pay a whopping $4 billion more in taxes, while people making $1 million or more would pay $5.8 billion less, according to an analysis of the Senate bill before its last-minute changes. And that doesn't take into account the massive cuts in services, health care, and other benefits that would likely result. Martin Wolf, the sober and fact-based chief economics commentator for the Financial Times, concludes, this is a determined effort to shift resources from the bottom, middle, and even upper middle of the U.S. income distribution toward the very top, combined with big increases in economic insecurity for the great majority. Wolf says the real puzzle is why this is a politically successful strategy. The Republican Party is pursuing an economic agenda for the 0.1%, but it needs to win the votes of the majority. In a recent essay, Berkeley political scientist Paul Pierson argues that Trump entered office with a set of inchoate ideas and no real organization. Thus, his administration was ripe for takeover by the most ardent, organized, and well-funded elements of the Republican Party, which are its libertarian wing. Nurtured and built up over the years, this group of conservatives decided to ally with the Trump administration to enact its long-standing agenda. So is it that the Republican Party is cleverly and successfully hoodwinking its supporters, promising them populism, and then enacting plutocratic capitalism? Many have argued that Republicans have been able to work this magic trick by dangling social issues in front of working-class voters who fall for the bait and lose sight of the fact that they are voting against their own interests. But what if people are not being fooled? What if people are actually motivated far more deeply by issues surrounding religion, race, and culture than they are by economics? There's increasing evidence that Trump's base supports him because it feels a deep emotional, cultural, and class affinity for him. And while the tax bill is being analyzed by economists, Trump picks fights with black athletes, retweets misleading anti-Muslim videos, and promises never to yield on immigration. Perhaps he knows his base better than we do. In fact, Trump's populism might not be as unique as it's made out to be. Polling from Europe now suggests that the core issues motivating people to support Brexit or the far-right parties in France and Germany and even the populist parties of Eastern Europe are cultural and social. The most important revolution in economics in the last generation has been the rise of the behavioral scientists trained in psychology who are finding that people systematically make decisions that are against their own interests. This might be the tip of the iceberg in understanding human motivation. The real story might be that people see their own interests in much more emotional and tribal way than scholars understand. What if in the eyes of a large group of Americans, these other issues are the ones for which they will stand up, protest, support politicians, vote, and even pay an economic price? What if for many people in America and around the world, these are their true interests? For more, go to cnn.com/Fareed and read my Washington Post column this week. And let's get started. From Michael Flynn's guilty plea to North Korea's missile, from a potential move of the U.S. Embassy to Israel to big question marks at the State Department, lots to talk about this morning here on GPS. We'll get right to it. David Sanger joins us from Washington. He is the national security correspondent for the New York Times and a CNN contributor. Here in New York, Ian Bremmer is the president of the Eurasia Group and a columnist at Time Magazine, and Julia Ioffe is a staff writer at The Atlantic. David, let me ask you, just step back for a minute and tell us, where do we stand now? Because if you looked in February, the White House said, basically, we had no contact with the Russians. Where are we now?
Well, Fareed, since February, we've discovered at least 9 members of the Trump transition team or the campaign who did have contact with the Russians. We found probably more than 30 contacts. So the initial story has sort of fallen apart. The early story about Michael Flynn, the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who then moved into the inner circle of the Trump campaign and became National Security Advisor for 25 days. His contacts are particularly fascinating. We were told initially that his conversations with Ambassador Kislyak, the Russian ambassador at the time to the United States, amounted to holiday greetings. That seemed improbable since they took place the day of and the day after President Obama put sanctions on Russia for the election meddling. We now know from the guilty plea that, in fact, they discussed the sanctions. And the suggestion seems to be, although we don't know the details of that discussion yet, that what he was doing was essentially saying, hold on, don't retaliate, we'll take care of this once we come into office. Now, the question is, why would he lie about this? And why would you actually make promises to a foreign government before you are in office? The right answer would have been, we hear your concerns, Mr. Ambassador, and we're happy to take it up with you at 12:30 p.m. on January 20th, but we can't until that time. And so now the question is, who else knows? And as we reported in the Times today, my colleagues reported that, in fact, there were many others who were consulted about these interactions with Ambassador Kislyak.
And as you said, David, you know, why does everybody keep lying about this if it's all very harmless? Julia, again, big picture, remind us, why is it that the Trump administration seems to have been trying to be nice to the Russians? Isn't that sort of the question is, all these moves seem to be moves to tell the Russians, you know, hold off, we're going to try and relax sanctions on you, we're going to try and have a different relationship with you. And presumably, at least many people have said, this is all because Trump was in some way being assisted by the Russians. Is that we don't have any proof yet on that first piece of the story?
That's right. I think that is the, however, you know, $100 million question, $64,000 question. That is the question, and there's still a lot we don't know. We know why the Russians were reaching out to the Trump campaign repeatedly and in many different ways, which is also very classic, right? You have lots of different kind of efforts going out, lots of tentacles reaching toward the Trump campaign, which is totally understandable, because you had Trump talking about how he wanted to respect Russia and get along with Russia, how he thought Putin was a great and strong leader, that he wanted to pull the U.S. back off the world stage, which is great for Russia because Russia wants to expand its presence on the world stage. So the more of a vacuum the U.S. creates for it in places like the Middle East, the better. So it's understandable why the Russians were reaching out. The question we don't know the answer to yet is why the Trump campaign seems so eager to, or the Trump transition team seems so eager to reach back out. What were the Russians offering to them? And, you know, other things we have no explanation for yet is why Jared Kushner, for example, was asking the Russian ambassador to set up a secret, secure channel from the Russian embassy in Washington to Moscow. And it was the Russian ambassador that said, no, you know, our equipment's a little too sensitive.
What is your reaction to the Flynn business?
Well, first of all, we know one reason why the Trump administration, the Trump campaign was so interested in trying to work with the Russians. That's because Paul Manafort, who was running the campaign, was actually on the payroll of the oligarchs close to the Kremlin. Leaving that aside, I think Jared is in real trouble here, because at the time that these conversations were happening between Flynn and the Russian ambassador, Jared was in charge of foreign policy for the Trump administration, for the Trump team. He was the one that was approving every meeting that Trump would or would not have with a head of state. He was the one that was determining foreign policy direction. So it begs credulity that he would not have been aware of exactly what Flynn was discussing with Kislyak. And if Flynn was saying, hey, we're going to make sure these sanctions come off, I think Jared was absolutely a part of that. There's no way we're not going to find that out. Now, I don't think that's collusion. For me, collusion implies that Trump and Putin were actually in some way working together to try to swing the election in an illegitimate way. I don't see that. But I do see breathtaking, staggering incompetence. I think that Jared had no idea that what he was doing was potentially problematic for what an administration would look like. And I think that there were no adults around them in the room. I mean, the Carter Pages, the Papadopouloses, the people that were advising Trump were not just the B list, they were the D list, because nobody thought they had a chance. And so as a consequence, a whole bunch of things that would have raised the antennas of people like Richard Haas or others that you have so frequently on this show and say, wait a second, this just isn't done. Those people weren't around Trump. And then you see his lying about it. The cover-up is what's going to get them an enormous amount of trouble.
All right, we've got to take a break. Stay right here. We will be back to talk about everything else.